Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. The international community is figuring out how to respond to the violence which began in Egypt last week as the military cleared camps filled with supporters of the deposed President Mohamed Morsi. The death toll now stands at 900 and this is expected to rise. Nabil Fahmy, the foreign minister in the military-backed interim government, has warned against the internationalization of the crisis, which he has described as Egypt's internal affair. But unsurprisingly, international concern is mounting. European foreign ministers are meeting in Brussels to review billions of pounds in foreign aid destined for Egypt. The United States has cancelled military exercises with Egypt, and Washington's bankrolling of Egyptian military to the tune of $1.5 billion a year is in the frame, especially as it depends on whether or not it considers the military intervention in Egypt a coup. Where does Egypt go from here, and what are the ideals of the revolution and the Arab Spring? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined in the studio by Mona Al-Kazaz. She's a spokesperson for the Muslim Brotherhood in London. Also here is Fatima Saeed, who's a spokesperson for the group British Egyptians for Democracy. On the line, we have Stephen McInerney, who is executive director at the think tank, the Project on Middle East Democracy, that's based in Washington, D.C. Mona Al-Kazaz, what is the situation for your colleagues? Are they in hiding? What is the news on the ground that you're getting?
Egypt has witnessed the worst state-led massacre in its history. The massacre is ongoing day in and day out. There are killing of innocent people in cold blood. People are being killed since the coup d'etat was orchestrated on the 3rd of July. But the intensity of killing is getting even worse and worse. The death toll I have from the makeshift field hospital is over 2,800 innocent, peaceful civilians were killed. The numbers are still obviously on the rise. We're seeing violations of human rights. We're seeing a return of a repressive state and a repressive regime. We're seeing all the return of state security and the security state. As an Egyptian, first and foremost, I want a democratic Egypt back. I want the return of human rights back. I don't want a military junta to be running my country anymore.
The Muslim Brotherhood, though, is calling for the reinstatement of Mohamed Morsi, for the results of that election to be honoured. Do you accept now that it is unlikely that Mohamed Morsi will return?
It is not about Mohamed Morsi. It is about the Egypt. It's about the free Egypt. First of all, we want the criminals to be brought to justice. Those criminals who have committed atrocious crimes against innocent, peaceful Egyptians should be brought to justice. We need the reinstatement of all the democratic bodies in Egypt. We want the Egyptian people to be able to choose whom to lead, whom would represent them, and who is going to lead the country. We want the military back to its barracks to protect the sovereignty of Egypt, and we don't want any interference of the military in the state. We obviously want national reconciliation, because this coup d'etat, we hold it responsible for the deepening polarization in Egypt. For us, it is about the free democratic Egypt. It's not about anything else. We want Egypt back freely and democratically. The problem is there are people who hijacked power from of the Egyptian institutions using the power of bullets and tanks, and obviously they failed at every democratic transition, and they came up as leaders on the back of the tanks.
What about your own personal experience, the experiences of those you know in Egypt and your colleagues in the Muslim Brotherhood? What has been their experience over the last few days?
As hundreds and thousands of Egyptians, there have been kidnapped, torture and murder of innocent Egyptians. My own brother has been kidnapped since as soon as the coup d'etat was orchestrated on the 3rd of July. We don't know where he is. We don't know who is detaining him. We don't know in which conditions is he detained in. Are there any lawyers? He doesn't have any access to lawyers or doctors. So obviously violations of the human rights started on the moment when the coup d'etat was orchestrated. I've lost 20 of my friends. 3 of my closest friends I've lost on Wednesday. They were killed in cold blood. One of them was an 18-year-old revolutionary who was burnt alive when she was taken refuge in a tent. And this, I can't describe them, those people, they burnt a tent where women were taking refuge, and my friend was burnt alive. And this is the criminality we're facing in Egypt. It's the return of a repressive regime. It's the return of a regime that it criminally disregards the sanctity of human lives. They vowed, the Ministry of Interior vowed to use live ammunition against innocent, peaceful civilians. They've taken the dream of our democratic dream of Egypt. They've taken it from us, and they are giving us they're killing us day in and day out. The international community should stand together to stop these violations of human rights. We should stop this slaughter of Egyptians and the slaughter of democracy.
Stephen McInerney, you're the executive director of the Project on Middle East Democracy. From your perspective, should the United States have come in a bit earlier? The overthrow of Mohamed Morsi, the United States has refused to condemn that as a coup. What do you think about the United States' role in this?
I think the United States has been far too timid and too unwilling to criticize its allies in Egypt, particularly most recently the Egyptian military. I think most certainly that this was a coup. I think the United States has tried to dissuade the military from taking certain steps, but I think it has failed to learn a lesson that we've seen repeatedly in Egypt, that its allies, including the Egyptian military, don't heed its advice unless real pressure is applied and real leverage is used. And I think the U.S. administration has been very reluctant to take that approach. They've asked the military not to intervene on July 3rd and were ignored. They asked the military repeatedly not to use large-scale violence against the protesters and the sit-in of the supporters of Mohamed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood, and that was disregarded. I think had they immediately taken a tougher stand on July 3rd, referred to this as a coup, as it clearly was, and suspended all assistance to the military and cooperation with the military, pending the military taking steps to lead Egypt in the direction of democracy, I think it's very likely that we might have seen the military behave differently.
Do you see the response of the United States as being a little bit mealy-mouthed? That if the US were to call it a coup, it would have to cut off more than $1 billion worth of aid to Egypt's military. Now, I'm wondering, is Washington more concerned about losing influence in the region there?
It is. I mean, from the perspective of the administration, they fear that if they cut off aid, that will somehow lose them influence. But I think the reality is that when they're not willing to use that influence, then the reality is they're losing it now. I mean, we've seen, some of the most important events that the U.S. should have been using its influence, its so-called influence, to avoid. And we've seen those events take place despite the U.S. relationship with the Egyptian military. I don't see the point of desperately clinging to a relationship so that you have influence if you're never able to successfully use that influence. And that's what we've seen. And I think it's also damaging to U.S. credibility in the region.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. We're discussing the revolution in Egypt with Mona El-Kazaz, Stephen McInerney and Fatima Said. Fatima Said, a spokesperson for the British Egyptians for Democracy. What do you think, from your perspective, did the events last week constitute a massacre? Do you think that the actions taken against the people who had camped predominantly Mohamed Morsi supporters, were the actions of Egypt's authorities reckless?
I would totally agree with that description. I definitely do think it's a massacre, and to say otherwise would be to speak out of ignorance. I'd just like to point out, and I think it's very important for your listeners to know, you described this as a pro-Morsi sit-in. I completely refuse that description, and I completely actually insulted that it's described as Muslim Brotherhood. I'm not Muslim Brotherhood, I'm not pro-Morsi, but I had friends who had joined the sit-in. This is beyond now figures or any groups. It's about democratic principles and rights being taken away. As British Egyptians for democracy, we are ultimately for democracy, and what we're seeing is the military junta in Egypt slaughtering democracy and its supporters. The military, unfortunately, has a very long history in Egypt. We're talking about over 60 years since the coup that was instigated in 1952 by Gamal Abdel Nasser. They've been repressive. They've been, targeting political opponents. We've seen massacres in the past happening. I saw with my own eyes. I was watching a live feed on Wednesday from the sit-in. Those people being burnt alive, women and children, despite any political differences. And I don't agree with the Muslim Brotherhood in a lot of things, actually. But despite these political differences, you can't let your humanity, your basic humanity, actually wane away, and your hatred shouldn't dictate what your feelings are towards this.
If we look at the comments made by people like Nabil Fahmy, the foreign minister, they insist that churches were being attacked, that there was violence meted out on behalf of Islamists. There was a wave of support within Egypt to do something about the camps. Would you not accept that?
First of all, I disagree with this term Islamist. It's terribly nebulous. I'm not sure what, grouping this whole pro-democracy movement as Islamists, painting them all with one brush in order to try and justify violence against them. I mean, Nabil Fahmy, he's had misinformation, misaccuracies before. He came on BBC Hard Talk and said that protesters had been armed and that Amnesty International had actually verified this. Amnesty International came out straight afterwards and actually refuted all these claims, absolutely refuted them. So, this whole idea of trying to portray the pro-democracy movement as terrorists, as violent protesters, it's the same tactic that was used by Mubarak in the revolution to portray the revolutionaries as terrorists, as people who are violent, to justify actions against them. It's simple. Once you label the pro-democracy movement as terrorists, as violent, you justify their slaughter, and that's what we've seen.
Interestingly enough, though, the protesters that were in Cairo who opposed Mohamed Morsi, a lot of them were devout Muslims, you could argue, but they didn't like an Islamist government. Now, is there the sense now that Egyptians want a secular government at all costs?
Okay, well, we've got to go and look at election results. Let's look at the hard facts. I may disagree with Islam or whatever political system is run, but if you look at the 5 previous elections, the results have been consistent every single time. The Islamists have won every single election. It's always been the same winners and the same losers, and unfortunately those losers have come back on the back of tanks, and they describe themselves as liberals and Democrats, but unfortunately they're the most illiberal group currently in Egypt. I may disagree with the result. I didn't vote for Morsi myself, may have disagreed with the government, but the whole idea is to respect the democratic institutions. And I think this is how victory, if you like, will be decided. It's not about whether Morsi is reinstated or Sisi goes away from the political scene. It's about democracy being respected in Egypt, about rights, about differences being respected.
And when Mohamed Morsi won the election, he won the ballot, he should have stayed in power.
In any democracy in the world, would it be accepted if someone who was voted in democratically through free and fair elections that were verified by international monitors, would it be right for the military to come in and step over? And I think people take this outside the context. And I don't want to talk about this because, I think this is beyond Morsi now. I want to speak about the military junta's crimes, and they have to be brought to justice for these crimes. It's beyond political figures now.
Mona Al-Kazaz, spokesperson for the Muslim Brotherhood in London. Mohamed Morsi was elected as president, but there were a lot of misgivings among a good sector of Egyptian society as the rolling back of freedoms and the influence of an Islamist government. What do you make of that? What do you make of the criticisms of Mohamed Morsi? Were they justified, do you think?
Democracies do not work with the 99.9% mentality we had during the dictatorship time. In democracy, half of the people agree for something and the other half do not agree for something, and there's a democratic process in place for people to debate things. The problem is the people who lose at the democratic process, they came to enforce their will, but they enforced it using the power of the tanks, which obviously resulted in mass murders and crimes against the Egyptian people. You can criticize Morsi, I can criticize Morsi, we can disagree with him politically, but that does not justify the slaughter of Egyptians, and that does not justify the slaughter of our democracy. There's a legal process actually in place. You can actually impeach a president if you're unhappy with him, but you don't orchestrate a coup d'état against the democratic process. The problem is when you orchestrate a coup d'état, the fruit and the outcome of a coup d'état is the violations of the human rights, is the return to an oppressive regime, is the violations against everyone. We're seeing targeting, particularly, for example, for international journalists or for media. We're seeing on the 4th of on Wednesday last week, we've seen targeting particularly of international journalists who are trying to cover the events of the massacre. They don't want their crimes to be documented. They have snipers in place to shoot whoever's trying to document what is happening. They don't want any independent witnessing to document their violations and their crimes. It is very, very important for us not to be taken down this propaganda machine by the state media, the propaganda machine that's trying to portray its political opponents as terrorists to justify their slaughters. The situation in Egypt is very, very dark. The leaders of the opposition who failed at every round of elections, now they came back as leaders. They've taken us through this coup d'etat into a very dark tunnel. and now they're fleeing. El-Baradei has fled yesterday to Austria. So after orchestrating a coup d'etat against a democracy in Egypt, there's blood on his hand.
So do you criticise his statement last week where he said that violence begets violence, and Mohammed al-Baradei is an internationally respected figure. He has actually opposed what's happened last week. What impact do you think that will have, somebody so respected turning his back?
So the crime was against the humanity. It was crime against Egyptian people, and he is a conspirator. On the next day of the coup d'etat, he had comments to the New York Times. He actually, between quotations, said he convinced Western governments to forcibly oust a democratically elected president, and he also said he justified the detention of opposition figures as necessary measures. What kind of a reputable person is that? This person has blood on his hand, and the whole military junta has blood on their hands, and we as the Muslim Brotherhood, we're going to pursue them in international courts to make sure that they are held accountable to the crimes against humanity, the crimes against the Egyptian people.
Fatima, can I get your response to that? Is Mohammed al-Baradei a co-conspirator? What do you make of that statement?
Mohammed al-Baradei, as you said, he is a respected figure. He's a Nobel Peace Laureate. But he describes himself as a liberal, and what we're seeing is it's not really liberalism. I think liberalism would shy away from this. This is not what liberalism and democracy is about. I mean, I respect that he actually stepped down and denounced the military's violence, but he still hasn't admitted that this is a coup. He hasn't come out and called for the end of military rule. If you're going to go and describe yourself as a liberal, you can't act in such an illiberal way. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is members of the government, many of whom are actually from Mubarak's time, it's a military-dominated government, so you have generals in there, they're just as complicit in these crimes. And I think let's even touch on a broader subject here. The army may have pulled the trigger, but it was people who stayed silent about these crimes in the West that loaded the gun. And speaking as a British Egyptian, and I'm proud to call myself a British Egyptian, but I'm absolutely ashamed of the stance and the silence taken by those who claim to represent British values of democracy, freedom and justice. Not one single, Western government has come out and admitted this is a coup, and it's ridiculous that we have to wait for the US to admit this is a coup for the whole world to actually recognise it. And I think Britain must have an independent foreign policy. They must, side with the Egyptian people, those supporting democracy on the streets today. They owe it to the Egyptian people after supporting Mubarak's dictatorship for decades. So I think, history will write, and which side of history will these people be on? Will you be on the side of the oppressor or the side of the oppressed?
Can I get the view from Washington, Stephen McInerney from the think tank, The Project on Middle East Democracy? The comment there that Fatima Said was making was really, it is a bit strange to wait for the United States to condemn this, but even if the United States didn't refer to this as a coup, and, there's still the backing of Saudi Arabia, there's still other players in the region, the United Arab Emirates, there is broad regional support.
The regional support is not universal. I mean, there are countries, you mentioned, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates as being very supportive of the coup and of the Egyptian military and the government, the interim government that's now in place. But other regional actors such as Qatar and Turkey have been had very different reactions and were very supportive of Mohammed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood, and have been very critical. And I think this can, in some sense, be viewed as a sort of standoff between this sort of emerging rivalry within the region. As far as the United States' role, I think that while you describe the support of some regional actors for what's happening, the United States does have an important role that's somewhat different from those regional actors. And as was mentioned, it does appear that other Western countries are looking to take the lead of the United States, and might agree that other Western countries should have be more independent foreign policy and being willing to be out in front of the U.S. on this if they like. But I think it very likely is the case if the United States were to take a tougher stance, other Western countries would follow their lead. And the truth is that the opinions of the international community, including Western countries such as the United States, it does matter in Egypt. And then the role of the international community is important. And that Egypt's place in the international community can't rely only on the support of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. If what we're talking about here, what many internationally would like to see in Egypt is a successful transition to democracy, and that's certainly what we all hope to see in 2011 when Hosni Mubarak was overthrown. Well, certainly, countries such as the Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are far from exemplars of democracy. They're both authoritarian monarchies, which have no interest in seeing democracy succeed in their region. And I think it would be a mistake for Egypt to rely only on the support of authoritarian monarchies.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. We're discussing the revolution in Egypt. With me in the studio is spokesperson for the Muslim Brotherhood in London, Mona El-Kazaz. Also here is Fatima Saeed, spokesperson for British Egyptians for Democracy. And on the line from Washington, D.C., Stephen McInerney, Executive Director of the think tank, the Project on Middle East Democracy. Indeed, Senator John McCain, who ran against Barack Obama in 2008, made the point on the BBC a couple of days ago that he believes that there should be a stronger response from the United States. But when questioned about whether or not that might endanger Egypt's peace deals with Israel, he said that may be a price worth paying. I mean, there's a regional aspect to this, and certainly this morning there was violence in the northeast of the country, in the Sinai. It's not just about Egypt itself, is it? America has to tread a fine line here.
That's true, but I would also argue that the sort of deterioration that we're seeing and the instability that we're seeing in Egypt also are something that's dangerous regionally as well. And if the U.S. is unwilling to take a stand in support of a transition to democracy in Egypt, then eventually, I think there are many dangers, including sort of civil war and a failed state in Egypt that would be a grave threat to all of its neighbors, including Israel. And so I think that it's sort of short-sighted to avoid making some tough choices and taking a hard stand for the sake of Egypt's relations with its neighbors. Egypt's relations with its neighbors certainly will not be served by further deterioration of stability in Egypt, which is what we're seeing at the moment.
I'm wondering what you make of the comments by Tawakkol Khan, the Yemeni uprising leader. She's warned that the destruction of Egypt's revolution means death for the Arab Spring. I mean, do you agree with that sentiment?
I hope that that's not the case, but I fear that it could be. On one hand, there are still opportunities for success in other countries of the Arab Spring, in democratic transitions, for example, perhaps in Tunisia. But I think that if Egypt fails in its transition, it has an enormous and outsized impact across the region, and a very negative impact. And I think Egypt, as the most populous Arab country, and Egypt has sort of a long-standing kind of historical role, and Egypt has often been sort of a bellwether for the entire region. And I think many of us, 2.5 years ago when the Arab Spring erupted, felt as though Egypt was probably the country that would have the biggest influence on the other countries in the region. And to see these very negative developments and the violence erupting in Egypt is something that will reverberate across the region and very likely make success more difficult in other countries. There are lots of very negative lessons that can be learned from what we've seen in Egypt, and we've already seen some of those lessons. We've seen some spillover in the past 6 weeks from the coup in Egypt. I think it's has emboldened opposition, sort of secular opposition activists, for example, in Tunisia, and I think it's very distressing that those in Tunisia, in general, Tunisia's transition has been proceeding much more smoothly, much more orderly than Egypt, and I think it's distressing to see Tunisia looking now to Egypt at a time when Egypt is moving in the direction of such violence and civil strife. Seeing secular opposition activists in Tunisia calling for the dismissal, calling for the removal of their of their prime minister, and also calling for the dismissal of their National Constituent Assembly that was elected. So I think we've already seen kind of the negative impact that these developments in Egypt can have across the region.
Egypt's population is 4.5 times the population of Syria. So the problem is that, obviously, as Stephen has mentioned, Egypt's population is much, much bigger, and Egypt's central location in the Middle East is absolutely crucial. For the Americans, my opinion is that it's a dilemma between interests and principles. The African Union did not hesitate in announcing a coup with its name. It's a coup d'etat. Whereas the Americans, actually, until now, 6 weeks after, almost 7 weeks now, they are hesitating in calling it a coup. And we think this is actually a tacit approval for the violations of human rights that are happening in Egypt. We've seen a massacre 5 days straight after the coup, and the security forces did not bow down. They said they would use more violence, and still the Americans didn't didn't call it a coup, and the international community was silent. And then another massacre, and then we've seen a massive massacre last Wednesday, and still they are still the military junta, the putschists, they're still using violence against innocent Egyptians, and the international community is backing up. They're not actually taking a clear stance against these human rights violations. I think it's very, very important for us to label everything with this name, just to start with, and then we need to take things further. The international community should refrain from dealing with this putschist government, this government that has a hijacked power in Egypt, using the power of weapons. This is not democracy. A coup d'etat in 2013, who would imagine the Western government or the American governments to be dealing with a putschist government in 2013? It's not the 1950s anymore, it's 2013, and the international community is responsible for the violations of human rights that are happening every day.
So what does the Muslim Brotherhood do now?
So Senator Graham came up yesterday, the day before yesterday actually, he mentioned that we were part of the talks as part of the coalition of legitimacy as the Muslim Brotherhood. We were representing the pro-democracy movement in Egypt, and we are the ones who accepted the negotiation terms. It was the General Sisi, the Minister of Defense. He was the one, as described by Senator Graham, he was intoxicated by power. The putschists are the ones who did not respond positively to the brokers and to the international mediation efforts, and we are the ones who agreed to it. As the Muslim Brotherhood, it's not about us anymore. It is about the bigger dream of Egypt. It's about the Egyptians, and we believe that Egyptians will take it peacefully to the end, until we end this military rule, until we end this repressive state, until we bring those criminals to justice.
I'll just give the final word to Fatima Said. William Hague made the point that this could take decades to play out. Democracy takes a long time. From the perspective of your group, are you confident or are you optimistic or hopeful that one day democracy, a functioning democracy, will take hold in Egypt?
Let's look back at the 25th of January, when we stood together as Egyptians as one hand against the dictatorship of Mubarak that we had been living under for 40 years of humiliation, strife, of oppression. We managed to topple his regime in 18 days. Nobody believed that this day would come. With Mandela in South Africa, how many years did it take? No one asked them how long would it take for democracy to come. We can never give up on democracy. If we give up on democracy, then we've given up on peace, we've given up on justice, we've given up our hopes and dreams. I believe beyond all the political differences in Egypt, beyond any differences, every single Egyptian wants peace, wants democracy to be reinstated in Egypt. I think what you're asking for is a solution. It's very simple. You look to what's caused the problem. And the reason why people are out on the streets now, the reason why we're seeing this violence, because the military coup was instigated. So firstly, you have to remove the disease. You can't treat the symptoms of the disease. You have to treat the disease itself. And the real cancer really wreaking havoc in Egypt now, it's the military. So remove the military, reinstate democratic institutions. I'm not talking about figures, and I think it's very important to make that differentiation. Reinstate democratic institutions and then have national dialogue, national reconciliation. The military junta promised us a roadmap, but unfortunately this roadmap, it leads to nowhere. We must have, an active stance against this. The international community must stand together and support democracy, no matter how long it takes.
That's Fatima Said, spokesperson for British Egyptians for Democracy. I was also joined in the studio by Mona Alcazaz, spokesperson for the Muslim Brotherhood in London. And on the line from Washington, D.C., Stephen McInerney, Executive Director of the Project on Middle East Democracy. Thank you all very much for joining me, Brendan Cole, on The Voice of Russia in London.
Choose whom to lead, whom would represent them, and who is going to lead the country. We want the military back to its barracks to protect the sovereignty of Egypt, and we don't want any interference of the military in the state. We obviously want national reconciliation, because this coup d'etat, we hold it responsible for the deepening polarization in Egypt. For us, it is about the free democratic Egypt. It's not about anything else. We want Egypt back freely and democratically. The problem is there are people who hijacked power from of the Egyptians institutions using the power of bullets and tanks, and obviously they failed at every democratic transition, and they came up as leaders on the back of the tanks.
What about your own personal experience, the experiences of those you know in Egypt and your colleagues in the Muslim Brotherhood? What has been their experience over the last few days?
As hundreds and thousands of Egyptians, there have been kidnapped, torture and murder of innocent Egyptians. My own brother has been kidnapped since as soon as the coup d'etat was orchestrated on the 3rd of July. We don't know where he is. We don't know who is detaining him. We don't know in which conditions is he detained in. Are there any lawyers? He doesn't have any access to lawyers or doctors. So obviously violations of the human rights started on the moment when the coup d'etat was orchestrated. I've lost 20 of my friends. 3 of my closest friends I've lost on Wednesday. They were killed in cold blood. One of them was an 18-year-old revolutionary who was burnt alive when she was taken refuge in a tent. And this, I can't describe them. Those people, they burnt a tent where women were taking refuge, and my friend was burnt alive. And this is the criminality we're facing in Egypt. It's the return of a repressive regime. It's the return of a regime that it criminally disregards the sanctity of human lives. They vowed, the Ministry of Interior vowed to use live ammunition against innocent, peaceful civilians. Egypt they've taken the dream of
Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. The international community is figuring out how to respond to the violence which began in Egypt last week as the military cleared camps filled with supporters of the deposed President Mohamed Morsi. The death toll now stands at 900 and this is expected to rise. Nabil Fahmy, the foreign minister in the military-backed interim government, has warned against the internationalization of the crisis, which he has described as Egypt's internal affair. But unsurprisingly, international concern is mounting. European foreign ministers are meeting in Brussels to review billions of pounds in foreign aid destined for Egypt. The United States has cancelled military exercises with Egypt, and Washington's bankrolling of Egyptian military to the tune of 1.5.
Getting even worse and worse. The death toll I have from the makeshift field hospital is over 2,800 innocent, peaceful civilians were killed. The numbers are still obviously on the rise. We're seeing violations of human rights. We're seeing a return of a repressive state and a repressive regime. We're seeing all the return of state security and the security state. As an Egyptian, first and foremost, I want a democratic Egypt back. I want the return of human rights back. I don't want a military junta to be running my country anymore.
The Muslim Brotherhood, though, is calling for the reinstatement of Mohamed Morsi, for the results of that election to be honoured. Do you accept now that it is unlikely that Mohamed Morsi will return?
It is not about Mohamed Morsi. It is about the Egypt. It's about the free Egypt. First of all, we want the criminals to be brought to justice. Those criminals who have committed atrocious crimes against innocent, peaceful Egyptians should be brought to justice. We need the reinstatement of all the democratic bodies in Egypt. We want the Egyptian people to be able to...
$1 billion a year is in the frame, especially as it depends on whether or not it considers the military intervention in Egypt a coup. Where does Egypt go from here? And what are the ideals of the revolution and the Arab Spring? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined in the studio by Mona Al-Kazaz. She's a spokesperson for the Muslim Brotherhood in London. Also here is Fatima Saeed, who's a spokesperson for the group British Egyptians for Democracy. On the line, we have Stephen McInerney, who is executive director at the think tank, the Project on Middle East Democracy, that's based in Washington, D.C. Mona Al-Kazaz, what is the situation for your colleagues? Are they in hiding? What is the news on the ground that you're getting?
Egypt has witnessed the worst state-led massacre in its history. The massacre is ongoing day in and day out. There are killing of innocent people in cold blood. People are being killed since the coup d'etat was orchestrated on the 3rd of July. But the intensity of killing is